It's my pleasure to invite Professor Kenneth Harrow, the Distinguished Professor of African Studies at Michigan State University, who is going to moderate the next panel, which is Rwanda, Strengthening Democracy, Challenges Ahead. Professor Harrow.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having invited me. Thank you for Chinua Achebe for having organized this panel. And in tribute to him, I would like to say, as a professor of African literature, that I have taught your books. That's the highest tribute that we can pay to an author, I believe. And I also want to recognize the presence of Amata Aidu in our gathering as well. So we have two giants of African literature to celebrate here today. My presence as moderator on this panel is due to the fact that I'm Amnesty International's country specialist for Rwanda and Burundi, and have been so since before the genocide in Rwanda. That's my interest, and that's why I have a focus upon Rwanda. To introduce the topic for our panel, which is Strengthening Democracy, Challenges Ahead, I'd like to read a few words about a description that was made, a description of Rwanda made briefly before the recent elections. A climate of fear and insecurity predominates the everyday life of average Rwandans. Anyone who questions RPF policies or its treatment of its opposition and critics can be beaten, harassed, intimidated into submission. Those who are perceived as sympathetic to the political opposition can be arrested or disappeared, like Rugambage murdered. The number of political prisoners as well as those disappeared is unknown, and so on. The wording in this article continues: to embrace democracy is to embrace the development ideas of President Kagame. Average Rwandans interpret democracy as a form of repression, and so on. This should be a little bit, this piece that I'm quoting from should be familiar to the previous moderator of the previous panel, because they're her words. So I think that they introduced the issue that we have to confront on our panel, which is the issue of democracy. We have an extraordinarily distinguished panel. I think the most famous Afrikaners that I know and whom I also teach are on this panel, and the most knowledgeable people dealing with Rwanda are on our panel. So we have a great panel. I'm going to give them a little bit more time than Susan because I'm more generous. But but then they can't talk to each other. When that's done, then we're going to have it, open it up to the floor, and I want you to jump at us and give us everything you've got. We'll have an exciting time.
Is it on? Yes. Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm really honored to be part of this panel, and I'm always very enthusiastic about events which celebrate Chinua Achebe's contribution to literature and to our continent. I think the last time we were together, we were on an occasion in the Library of Congress to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Things Fall Apart. So this one is to be credited to him and his family and to Brown University for facilitating some of the aspirations that Chinua Achebe has for our people. On the issue of Rwanda, my knowledge is partly from neighboring countries. I lived in Uganda a long time and dealt therefore with Rwandans in exile. I lived in Uganda 15 years. I'm a Kenyan and have related to you. And of course, I have been to Rwanda and expressed myself there, sometimes at the cost of heated debates, but Rwandans are used to much more serious confrontations than the one I had in Kigali. There is two levels of democratization I want to address myself to. One is interim democratization. I think Rwanda is unlikely to be adequately democratic this century at all. So what we ought to work on is to achieve some level of democratization based on the material we have, including the memories of the people and the boundaries of the country. And in the interim period, very relevant are to try and build institutions which help to make the rulers more accountable, the ruled more democratically participatory, the society more open, complete with open debate, the economy more subject to rules of social justice, and an area which has already been entered into in a big manner, and that is the history of memory, how to deal with memory, how to ensure there is a short memory of hate, making history and the truth not an absolute, but more subject to a cost-benefit analysis. To quote a French thinker more than a century ago, the secret of nation building is to get your history wrong. So you need to revise your history in a particular direction if you are to transcend some of the memories that impede nation building. The long-term democratization needs adjustments to the country's demographic composition. I think, again, that's my most heated debate in Rwanda, was my arguing that the present boundaries of Rwanda will never permit adequate democratization. So you need a long-term revision of the territorial definition of Rwanda. Adequate democratization this century cannot be achieved, but we can attempt to have some level of it as much as possible. Why am I so pessimistic? Because I believe Rwanda should be viewed as a dual society instead of a plural society, and a dual society has major difficulties in reconciliation. A dual society is one in which two ethnic groups or two nationalities are the overwhelming majority of the working political population. Adversarial dualism is when the two groups are still at a stage of pre-national reconciliation. Some countries have chosen breakup. Czechoslovakia decided, it was a dual society, decided to split up into two separate Czech and Slovak republics. Cyprus is in a stalemate between Greek Cypriots in the south and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in the north, with participation of Turkey in stabilizing the stalemate. The Somali are not ethnically distinct, but there is now a separate Republic of Somaliland with the capital Hargeisa from the Somaliland of Mogadishu. Now, because the Hutu and Tutsi are not geographically separated, so neither the Czechoslovakia solution of partition nor the Cypriot solution of geographical stalemate is possible for Rwanda. But there is a third solution, which, though extremely difficult, is worth considering. Since we have time geographically, I don't think we'll democratize this century, but we should prepare at least for full democratization next century. This solution is to unite the dual societies of Rwanda and Burundi with a plural society. My own choice has been Tanzania, but when I spoke on that subject in Kigali, some of the critics of my solution said, well, we could live with being united with Kenya, but for some reason at that time, they were not very enthusiastic about being united with Tanzania. But the idea is to help the Hutu and Tutsi to get their history constructively wrong by being part of a wider pluralistic societies. So in such a unification, the armies of Rwanda and Burundi will either be dissolved or be united with the armed forces of the United Republic of Tanzania. The governments in Kigali and Bujumbura would become provincial governments in a federation or in a form of union like that of Zanzibar and Tanganyika, which currently constitute the United Republic of Tanzania. And these unifications will also facilitate the memory selectivity I was recommending. is there any evidence that if Hutu and Tutsi lived in a plural society, they would more permanently cease to be genocidal towards each other every third decade? There is indeed a precedent in Uganda, where I lived for 10 years. The Republic of Uganda does have a population the equivalent of Tutsi and Hutu, but in Uganda the Tutsi bear the name of the Hima or Bahima, and in Uganda the Hutu bear the name of Iru or Bairu. Together, the Bahima and the Bairu, popularly known as Banyankole in Uganda. Uganda's Hima and Iru find what they have in common because they live in a plural society, rather than emphasizing what differentiates them. And what makes them different from the Baganda, the Banyoro, the Nilotes like the Acholi is much more conscious for them than the division between themselves as Bahima and Bairu. So the Tutsi-Hutu differentiation becomes less compelling than the fact that they are different from the Baganda, Banyoro, Acholi, etc. Indeed, since 1986, the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, has been, to all intents and purposes, a Muhima, a Tutsi. I have discussed regional integration as a solution to deadly dualism from time to time. Okay, I'll wrap up. So I should mention at least my conversation with the late Julius Nyerere, when I recommended to him that, look, you are trying to help Rwanda deal with this problem. It's not going to happen unless you have a solution similar to the one you had for Zanzibar, which united Tanganyika, unite Zanzibar with Tanganyika in order to reduce revolutionary violence on the island. Nyerere agreed with my premise that democratic peace was impossible in Rwanda under its present boundaries, so the whole of East Africa needs to come together to help their neighbors. But he thought the regional integration solution for Rwanda and Burundi's needs should go beyond uniting with Tanzania. So Rwanda and Burundi should be federated, he said, with Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda as a multi-plural society. I thought uniting with so many countries would take a long time, and I thought just uniting with Tanzania would make the Hutu and Tutsi see themselves as having a lot in common as contrasted with other Tanzanians. But I learned a lot from Julius Nyerere's response, that we need wider regional integration if we are to solve some of these problems. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of the type we had in South Africa do help in sharpening memories for a while, but the long term should still be selective memory in South Africa. Beware of the full truth in a country like Rwanda, South Africa, and Germany, because the full truth can be devastating unless you have acquired enough of a capacity to shorten the memory of hate. The truth can be a deadly impediment to healing. The secret of national healing is an effort to get our history selectively wrong. Thank you.
It's wonderful. Thank you very, very much. The next speaker is younger than I am, so I'm not going to call him Walimu, but I do refer to his work all the time in trying to keep up with what's happening and understand what's happening in the Great Lakes. Timothy Longman, Visiting Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of African Studies Center at BU.
Thank you. And thank everyone for coming today. I have to say I feel somewhat intimidated being on a panel and in a room with a large number of people whose work I have assigned in my classes over the years. I still think of myself as a young scholar just coming out of the field in Rwanda back in the early 1990s, although the thinning of my hair is showing that, in fact, that self-perception is perhaps a little wrong. I do have the privilege of having spent a lot of time in Rwanda over the past 20 years, having done research there in 1992 and 1993. I went back as the head of the Human Rights Watch office in 1995 and 96, and then I was fortunate to have a MacArthur Foundation grant from 2001 through 2003, and another grant from the U.S. Institute for Peace from 2004 through 2006 that allowed me to travel extensively in Rwanda and conduct quite a bit of research. And so I want to speak to this issue of democracy really based on that research, and based in particular on having spent a lot of time on the hills of Rwanda talking to ordinary people much more than people in the governments and elites. I want to pick up on 2 points that were raised in the last panel. And then I want to talk specifically about what I think Rwandan people think of as democratization and what the vision is among common people for democracy. First of all, I think there was an important point that's raised, that criticizing the current government and calling for the protection of human rights and for representative government is not the same thing as denying the genocide. Unfortunately, the debate that we have about Rwanda today often becomes polarized between those who want to say that everything is great in Rwanda right now, and if you don't think so, you're a genocidaire, and those who want to say that, in fact, there are some problems. As an American, I consider myself a patriot, and yet I criticize my government extensively, and I think that we could become more democratic. I don't see democracy as an end state. I think there are many ways in which I would like my government to behave differently, and I would like to have greater representation, greater transparency, and I would like my government to improve. And so, again, I don't think that makes me a bad American. I don't think that makes me disloyal, and I certainly don't think it makes me a genocidaire if I say similar things about Rwanda. A second point that was raised in the last panel is something that I find often quite eerie, and that is that the rhetoric that was used about the Habyarimana regime to defend its bad human rights record often is quite similar to the rhetoric that is used today to defend the current government. There's a rhetoric about the developmental state, which argues that economics is all that really matters, and if you can get economics right, then everything else will follow. There was a tendency when I was living in Rwanda in 1992 and 93 and witnessing human rights abuses around me and people who were living in fear and Tutsi friends who were coming to me and saying, should I flee the country because I'm afraid of what could happen? And at that time, there were many people outside of Rwanda and some within Rwanda who were saying, yes, there are some human rights abuses here, but really this is a government that's not as corrupt as most other African governments. They do a good job of organizing the economy. They're bringing development. They're bringing in international aid, and our economy is growing despite its great limitations in natural resources. The rhetoric that's used about the current regime is frighteningly similar. The fact that many human rights abuses are justified in the name of development, in the name of schools and medicine and economic progress in particular, to me is eerily similar to what I heard in the period leading up to the genocide. I don't think that's necessarily leading towards another genocide, but I do find it quite disturbing. So those are 2 points that I think were raised before that I really do think are important when we think about democracy. However, I will define myself as someone who is a big believer in democracy, but not necessarily in democracy as we traditionally think about it. As Professor Mamdani suggested, the definition of democracy that focuses just on elections that is often proposed by the international community is a wholly inadequate definition. And what I found in 2 decades of talking to a lot of Rwandans, interviewing people who are farmers and day laborers and bicycle taxi men and a whole range of people in various non-influential positions in Rwanda, is that there are people with an extraordinary capacity. There are people who have endured terrible things and have found in their own lives ways to live together. For the most part, Hutu and Tutsi, even in the period before the genocide, lived together in relative peace. And in the period after the genocide, because the Hutu and Tutsi live in integrated communities, they have had to learn to live together. And what's been told to me again and again by Rwandan people is that if they were left to their own devices, there would be no violence. The violence in Rwanda was not spontaneous. It didn't come from the bottom. It came from the top. It was organized, and it was orchestrated by people with power, and people participated for a variety of reasons. In research that we did extensively in 2001 and 2002, survey in particular, we talked to people. One of the questions we asked was, do you agree with the statement that whatever regime, well, there were two statements, that whatever regime comes into office changes history to serve its own purposes. People overwhelmingly agreed with that, not surprisingly. And the other statement was, if left to ourselves, violence would not be a problem. And most people agreed with that. What's interesting is that in both of those cases, ethnicity was irrelevant in terms of how people respond. Hutu and Tutsi both felt that very strongly, that in fact, if the people were left to themselves, they wouldn't fight. But one of the things that's very clear from talking with people is that they are often very skeptical of what we traditionally mean by democracy. In the period 1992 and 93, I recently went back and looked at my notes from my research then, and one of the things that was very clear is that some people were quite enthusiastic about the move towards multi-party democracy. But a lot of other people said, well, I don't really see that much difference between the parties. They're not bringing power to us. And no matter who's in charge, they're going to use us and they're going to get rich themselves. There was a real skepticism with the nature of party politics as it was taking place. Now, unfortunately, the Habyarimana regime would use that as an excuse for trying to suppress dissent. But what people were really saying, what came through clearly, is they wanted power in their own hands. They wanted real democracy. And their vision of democracy was one that had a lot less to do with what was going on in Kigali than with what was going on in the hills. People wanted to be able to control their own lives and make significant decisions about their own society as it affected them directly. This is something that I continued to hear in the various periods of research that I've done since then, going back to Rwanda, is that, yes, people are skeptical of multi-party politics, as Ambassador Kimonyo mentioned in the consultations that were done to write the Constitution. There were, in fact, many people who said, well, we don't want multi-party politics. And in many people's perspectives, multi-party politics was one of the things that helped to contribute to the genocide because it was so divisive and there was so much violence in the period even before the genocide between the political parties that wasn't necessarily ethnic. In fact, the parties that were primarily Hutu from the south were battling the parties that were primarily Hutu from the north. And these were things that I was seeing there in 92 and 93. People are very skeptical of parties as they've been presented and as they see them happening in various other African countries. But that doesn't mean people don't want democracy. It means they want a different kind of democracy that actually allows them to have a voice, that allows them to have a real influence over the decisions that make a difference in their daily lives. Rwanda has moved towards a system of decentralization, at least on paper. But one of the things I found in my research has been that, in fact, real power has not been brought back to the people. The fact that I say there are problems with the way that we tend to push democracy should not be seen as an excuse for the current government to continue its policies. One of the things that is real for Rwandans today is that many of them live in fear. They don't express it very openly because they can't. I got an email in the period leading up to the election from a friend who lives in a smaller city in Rwanda saying, we wake up every day with fear in our stomachs, wondering what is going to happen to us today. And he said that it's a situation that's very bad, but no one can talk about it. The elections were not free and fair, but even if they had been more open, they still wouldn't have solved the problem of bringing real power to the people of Rwanda. I think that if we're going to look for solutions on how to bring democracy to Rwanda, they have to start with having some faith in the people. To assume that Rwandans are, and Hutu in particular, by definition genocidaire, is to say that democracy can never work. But to believe that people, if they are empowered and allowed to have a real voice, can make a difference in their lives and will not necessarily turn to violence, I think is a faith that so far we've not seen from politicians on any side in Rwanda. The answer for me is to look to the people of Rwanda and to believe in them and to believe that they have a capacity for change. If there were some way we could get all the leaders out of the way, Rwanda would be a peaceful country.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Dr. J. Paul Martin, Director of Human Rights Studies at Barnard College.
I too am absolutely delighted to be here because when you teach Americans about Africa, the one book you can know everybody has read is When Things Fall Apart. So I think that there's a sense of, incredible importance of making Africa visible, to Americans, and that book has been absolutely critical in that process. I'm going to talk from the point of view of what Mahmood just called then institutions that define political community. And the institution I want to sort of say a few words about is education and the education systems that exist. And I'm not going to talk so much, in fact, I'll come to it in a point, about Rwanda itself, but about a study that we've been doing over the last 6 years of the role of human rights education in post-conflict type situations. And so just initially, I want to just run through some of the conclusions we've come to in those studies, which are primarily based in post-conflict communities in Latin America and in Africa. We define human rights fairly broadly, namely as learning that promotes knowledge, skills, behaviors, and attitudes needed to promote human rights and social justice. So it's an inclusive definition. We found, though, on the ground very clearly, and this supports what Timothy's just been saying, very strong support for that sort of education on the part of local leaders, local people, and local teachers, especially those who've been victims and witnesses of violence. We also found that the support on the part of many local and international government officials was marvelous in principle, but there was very little follow-up in terms of enforcing policies and making the money available. We found also that human rights education works best when it addresses directly the problems the particular learners face outside the classroom. So any sort of more theoretical type of education which didn't have some relevance to their lives was not highly valued and was not liked to be very useful and soon neglected. We also found that I call them villagers, but that human rights wasn't strange to them, that they knew what they were. Local leaders had little difficulty in identifying unjust activities. What they were missing very often was the idea that government had a responsibility to protect them. And so in terms of human rights education, that's one of the things we try to push. Obviously, human rights education takes many forms, but one of the areas where a lot of work has to get done is precisely the problem we're dealing with here, namely, where does education go with regard to deeply entrenched discrimination in the society? And I think this, again, we go back a bit to the premise that Mahmood talked about, was we have to live together. And so when we're talking about human rights education in post-conflict situations, we're generally saying that's what we have to do. We have to rebuild a society, people have to live together, and we have to find the mechanisms to do that. And I think one of them is clearly some process of deconstructing the social constructs which are in the minds of the people. And the social contracts then are based on all forms of difference and diversity, and typically on more or less objective phenomena such as skin color, religion, or language. But then they very quickly get construed into an us and them type of relationship. I mean, I always remember a Congolese who came to our program once, and he had to travel through Kigali. And he said to me, I was treated, and I won't use his word, very badly in the airport, you see. And I said, why? He said, because they thought I was a Hutu. And I said, why do they think you are Hutu? And they said, he said, the width of my nose, you see. So clearly from that little thing, a lot gets construed. I mean, it's like once I was in England, and I'm English, going to play cricket, and people said to me, how do you know how to play cricket? So I said, because I was born here. Oh, they said, we thought you were an American. So I said, why? He said, your shoes. So these are the sorts of social constructs that sort of pervade our life, and which, as an educator, you really have to think about them and look about how you go about it. We also found then that there was no question of human rights education being a standalone activity. The questions of economics, the questions of society, the questions of religion, the questions of politics all have to somehow or other filter into that. So you're not trying to just teach one thing, you have a society situation around us. Now, looking more directly at Rwanda, I mean, clearly there's a lot of good things going on. There's community building, there's youth education, there's gender equity and equality, there's economic development, there's rule of law, there's international partnerships, and there's even a National Human Rights Commission. So, but on the negative side, the thing which is really the sort of undercurrent and the sort of big elephant, if you like, in the room, but we're all talking about it, is the problem of victor's justice. The problem that the narrative of genocide is sacrosanct, that any discussion of continuing problems of discrimination associated with ethnicity is prohibited, and that prevents a lot of other things happening. There's an official story defined by the government. And missing is any recognition, which you've all said here, of the fact that any social analysis, any history, is inevitably subjective and tentative, if not partisan. So the suppression of debate that touches on social divisions is justified then, as we've seen before, on the basis of a theory that if suppressed, time will sort of help these distinctions disappear. But I think if we look at Chile and Argentina, who didn't have anything like the same sort of ethnic divisions and reinforcements, it just takes a long time. It's something that sort of ethnically rooted social constructs of identity, of loyalty, allegiance, of history, heroes, enemies, etc., like that, especially in the wake of as many deaths as there were in Rwanda, is a much harder problem to attenuate than faced by Chile and Argentina. So education then, in human rights terms, has to face problems of reconciliation, has to deal with questions of forgiveness, has to deal with legal actions. But the problem, of course, is not so much the goals as how you go about it. And I think there, Africa has lots of very interesting programs going on. One of the ones that impressed me most has been the use of theatre, such as township theatre in South Africa, or theatre for development in Burkina Faso. These are quite fascinating processes where the community is helped to deal with its issues in some more objective way and discuss it in ways then that it's a little bit more hypothetical than the actual problem they're facing on a day-to-day basis, but they begin to see these problems in larger terms. So I think that's just two cases like that. But there are many other ways in which then African communities are finding ways to begin to address the problems and develop that concept, we have to live together. However, this is my final point, from the point of view of human rights education, my immediate recommendation is quite modest, namely train some teachers. Because when we look at these programs, we see probably three things that really matter. One is money, in other words, to have some money to buy the books, etc., like that. The second thing is to have a good design. So in other words, there are lots of human rights programs, but only some are really working. And the last point is then the quality of the teachers. It's not easy to teach a group of people who are, in fact, then harboring feelings of hostility, latent or otherwise. And the question is, how do you go about it? So the recommendation very much is towards Rwanda is to sort of develop training programs that begin to address topics like critical thinking, topics like conflict management, as a regular part of every teacher's training, and then using those as basis then to incorporate a sort of human rights vision. So I think that human rights is very much part of the equation. Rwanda government wants to say it is part of the equation. Someone like me says, but they've got a long way to go to really make it real in the institutions of the society.
Thank you very much. I think we should all check our shoes before we go out today. Our next speaker, Dr. Scott Newton, School of Oriental and African Studies from the UK.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to state for the record that I consider myself as well a child of Things Fall Apart, which I read a very long time ago, and which, along with Professor Achebe's other works, was formative in my own engagement with Africa. And I'm grateful to him for inviting me here, and I'm honored to be here. In my comments today, I'm going to speak as a lawyer, because that's my trade, and ask what contemporary legal developments reveal about the direction in which Rwanda is moving. At the outset, I want to state that I don't believe states should enjoy immunity from criticism on the strength of the suffering of victims of mass atrocity or the culpability or indifference of the international community, and that holds as much for the Rwandan state as it does for the Israeli state. States are monopolists on the legitimate use of violence. States wield a lot of muscle. States need to be challenged and criticized and monitored. If states see like a state, I think it's incumbent on the rest of us not to see like a state. The history of international involvement in Rwandan affairs, from the German colonization to the present, is a very checkered and blemished one, which places international critics in an uncomfortable position. So be it, but my concern is less with the morality of contemporary international engagement with Rwanda than with the politics and political economy, just as it is with the politics and political economy of President Kagame's Rwanda itself. To the problem at hand. The difficulty with strengthening democracy in Rwanda is the assumption that the goal is marked out in advance with a high degree of institutional specificity, and that the trajectory can therefore be precisely calibrated like an artillery shell. The concept of democratization and the discourse around it, whether in Iraq or Rwanda or Tajikistan, are by now so heavily freighted and so manifestly faulty in their premises and predicates that it's very hard just to talk about the challenges ahead. Part of the problem with democratization is the false assertion that all good liberal things run together in a kind of Panglossian harmony. Democracy, for which read North Atlantic political institutions, human rights, for which read civil and political rights only, and markets, for which read minimalist regulation and redistribution, a business-orientated, not a social state. My colleagues have already talked about the preoccupation with elections and leadership change, which to me is a kind of electoral fetishism, which places a great deal of emphasis on balloting, but comparatively little on popular participation in policy formulation and administrative decision-making and allocation of resources. Who gets what on what terms, not who's in office. What's been called a thin theory of democracy. Indeed, the fixation on elections at the expense of what happens between them is characteristic of democracy exporting and democracy promoting states. Hence the notoriety in the Western press of the 93% polled for the president in the August elections and of the circum-electoral irregularities and violence, the arrest of Victoria Ingabire and her US lawyer, and Barnard and Ntaganda, the suspension of Umuseso and Mvugizi, and the flight of their editors, etc. What was singularly absent from the coverage was any sense of the campaign itself, of the matters at stake. The campaign was presented as devoid of issues, policies, positions, as though this were an election about democracy, and the opposition forces were merely a placeholder for democratic values themselves. Even if it were construed as a bare referendum on the president's policies, yay or nay, there was no sense of those policies in the reporting. The problem with democracy talk respecting Rwanda is not that there aren't at present very serious and concerning anti-democratic tendencies in Rwanda, but that democracy and democratization might not be especially serviceable or salient frames for understanding and addressing the complexities of contemporary Rwandan politics. The broader questions to ask about Rwanda, for this lawyer at least, are about the manner in which and the purposes for which public power has been exercised, the way it is configured legally and institutionally, and its political and political economy rationale, historically and now, the continuities and the changes. The problem is that the genocide has a tendency so to overshadow everything else that it becomes difficult to see either those continuities or those changes clearly. At times it seems as though conflict, perhaps particularly horrific conflict, had wiped the historical slate clean, so that one could concentrate energies and attention on justice and reconstruction and fashion a new polity altogether. To a neutral eye, not spellbound by gacaca and transitional justice, the continuities in the nature and structure of public authority across the genocide are striking. Rwanda has always been a developmental state using authoritarian political structures to advance collective goals identified by the leadership for and on behalf of the mass of the population, with little opportunity for consultation and contestation. I would gloss what Mahmood has said and claim that the developmental state is precisely the modern form of the colonial state. This relation of state to people characterized the Belgian colonial state, the first and second post-colonial republics, the genocidal republic in 1994, and the post-conflict RPF state. In Rwanda, Post-conflict processes in politics have, if anything, reinforced the authoritarian developmental state, not weakened it. It is, after all, now comprehensively militarized as well, a national security state as well as a developmental state. Now, there might be good and cogent reasons for Rwanda to embrace these state models, but neither, it will readily be grasped, is particularly conducive to flourishing democracy. And yet there are equally striking changes as well, which make doing justice to the post-conflict political record so very difficult. Rwanda is among the strangest and most distinctive polities anywhere, and Paul Kagame, like him or not, one of the world's most complex and extraordinary statesmen. Rwanda's contemporary history is little short of fantastic. No one could have imagined at the time of the Arusha Accords that a couple of decades forward, the country would figure as both a continental great power with a formidable strategic reach, as witness its ongoing regional military operations, and an exemplar of rationalized accountable administration, so-called good governance, and successful private sector-led development to boot, recently notching up first place as leading reformer in the World Bank's Doing Business report. All of this, moreover, in the aftermath of a staggeringly brutal and murderous resumption and resolution of the civil war that the Accords were intended to settle. Law and legal change in Rwanda since the genocide reveal this double face, progressive in some respects, retrogressive in others. But law in Rwanda has historically been the tool of ruling elites to effect policy. Recent Rwandan legislation demonstrates the persistence of this sort of legal instrumentalism, albeit for different purposes, favoring entrepreneurial initiative amidst tight, continued political control. The sort of mix of economic liberalism and political illiberalism, which one might venture to call the Chinese path to growth, authoritarian capitalism. There's no question but that Rwanda has undertaken the long-deferred job of dismantling the surviving elements of the framework of colonial administration, the Inheritance Law of 1999, recognizing equal inheritance rights for women, the Land Law of 2005, finally abolishing customary land tenure, but preserving the state's historic prerogative in the ownership and regulation of land transfers, and moreover committing to land consolidation. Rwanda has been notably successful in establishing new institutions of accountability, oversight and monitoring, the Auditor General's Office, the Public Service Commission, and yes, the National Commission on Human Rights, which has a record of holding officials to account, which if not robust, is at least not entirely supine. New commercial courts and a new common law commercial framework, company law, contract law, secure transactions, reveal a seriousness of purpose and professionalism which is characteristic of the regime. But all of this is really just scaffolding for the National Development Plan, which is primary, and I don't want to fetishize the significance of law. I'm skirting the relation between transitional justice and democracy only because it has been the focus of the comments of others. Let me note that the criminal code provisions of divisionism and genocide ideology serve as tools of political repression, much as anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda once did elsewhere. The force of much new legislation lies in the way in which it operates to entrench and institutionalize RPF rule without ever directly providing so, the unique capacity of law to legitimize or enable an existing allocation of power through general rules. Rwanda is not an especially open society, but it never has been one. Even among its developmentalist colleagues in the post-colonial period, the Rwandan state stood out as particularly opaque and repressive and closed off and closed in, an object of fear and obedience, a bit of Eastern Europe and Central Africa. Authority was concentrated, husbanded, and unchallengeable. There were many complex factors at work, historical, cultural, and political, but ethnic domination and correlative subordination with a dark star at the center, which exerted gravitational force on the whole system. Political control today is every bit as comprehensive. It is just more professional, nuanced, and sophisticated, altogether up to date. It speaks the universal language of post-conflict stabilization, good governance, and globalization, and is therefore perfectly intelligible to outsiders. As far as the ethnic factor is concerned, after genocide, victory in civil war, and return from exile, it continues to exert its occult gravitational force, even more so because taboo. You will have guessed I'm not very sanguine about the prospects for some degree of deconcentration of authority and some degree of political pluralism in Rwanda in the near term. Let me conclude by saying that whenever and however and whether at all Rwandan politics get pluralized, or the abortive 1993 project of reinventing the polity, at the time for all the wrong reasons, or refounding the political community, in Mahmood's phrase, is likely to come about, is finally resumed, it's not likely to come about by force of democratization assistance from without. The legal constitutional engineering that might be involved is very much a home job and will have to be worked out by the parties themselves on the basis of what Mahmood has called political justice. And let me just say that the political justice resolution has to precede the set of institutional arrangements. That is, the set of institutional arrangements should reflect political justice. They're not going to be able to bring it about. President Kagame is not looking for donors, as he has clearly stated. He's looking for investors and partners. And he doesn't take kindly to those with an institutional agenda to push, however notionally benign. He's made his wager and charted his own institutional course with exceptional cogency and particularity. So the rest of us are going to have to accept that for the time being, Rwanda deems itself free to choose among and to combine as it pleases the elements of democracy, human rights, and markets.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Colleen Driscoll, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Quinnipiac University.
Hard to say. Yes, I'm very happy to be here. I want to add that to other speakers' the statements that it is really a pleasure to be here and for me to be among all these African experts. And I want to commend the students who are here also. When I left Villanova and went to Quinnipiac, I discovered there was nothing in the way of African studies. And so I'm here to learn to a large extent because I'm setting up in the political science department an African studies aspect of it. So everything that everyone's saying is really fodder for this program that we will have at Quinnipiac. What I want to do is really just talk about some general aspects of governance in Africa, and with a couple of comments on what Rwanda is doing. But just a few brief words about what Africa has overcome in order to get to what we refer to as good governance, and then what is really required for good governance, and a little bit of some future ideas of what Africa can do in order to help to move itself forward in a democratic process. We start the international aspect of political science by looking at the concept of the nation state. But the concept of the nation state came about because of a war that the Europeans had. And this became the standard for political reality, which meant then that new countries coming in were going to have to sort of find a way to reach this standard. And when we get to the 20th century and self-determination becomes the norm for the many countries that yet were not independent, the original the colonizers, the countries that had been in charge of the areas of Africa, decided that they themselves would determine just what it is that a nation state would look like, and that those countries that did not have the same amount of time to define what democracy was, to define good governance, to refine that over 300 years as the Europeans had, that they could determine how these other countries would develop. And so what you see is Africa coming in sort of at the last minute to these concepts and having to adjust itself, to what were European ideas of governance. And for Africa, it was very difficult because they were being given rules, political rules by which they had to establish their own governments. And among those rules was that democracy was the best form of government. And so in trying to deal with democracy, you had societies that had to define themselves as one political unit. But they weren't there yet. They weren't really capable of doing that yet. So without the united population, without the clarity that comes from deciding what their own country will look like, what borders they will have, they had to learn how to try to retain their own ethnicity, their own cultures, and then identify themselves with a political goal that had been established outside of themselves. And thus, it was going to take time for a political contract to be made between the people within these new countries and the countries themselves. And I think they're still in the process of making that political contract. And until they could identify themselves as a country, as a group of nations within a state, there was going to be disruption. There were going to be fractures. I think the world outside of Africa didn't really understand that this was going to happen. And so it's no wonder that the African states have had to work out the arrangement between their disparate peoples and to try to identify themselves as a country with a dedicated citizenry. I have a quote from a book that's called Political Governance of Cultural Diversity, and it talks about identity and democracy in this way. The core feature of the modern nation state is a structural coupling of political organization and collective identity, which has deeply shaped our political vocabulary, including such notions as constitutionalism, democracy, and human rights. So if we're going to speak of democracy, then we have to try to understand exactly what it is that it means. And I agree with Professor Longman that this is not just one idea and that governments are going to look all the same. It's not going to be the same. Other countries were going to have to design their democracies to fulfill their own specific needs. And before you actually talk about strengthening democracy, you have to understand what is required. Now, there's certain things that we take for granted that are part of democracy. A governmental structure, a constitution, or some form of customary and written law, a participation of the citizenry in decision-making, a justice system, and all those basic things that we seem to accept as part of democracy. But to look specifically at some of the things that are necessary in order to have a democratic system, and I want to start out with core values, and the core values are responsibility, accountability, and transparency. And so these are just some of the things that I think are part of this, and certainly this is not a complete listing. One thing that's needed is the stability of the government structures, and with clear guidelines as to the authority, the roles of those who are involved in that government, with policies that are generated in the interest of the country as a whole, without conflict, and that with the understanding that there's going to be normal political competition that happens in every country. And Rwanda is, I believe, in the process of building their institutions at this point in time with, as you've heard, a lot more that needs to be done in order to work toward what is really what we refer to as a democratic system. The stability of society with the integration of all the ethnic and cultural groups, including immigrants, former combatants, into the democratic system so that all citizens feel that they have a part in making decisions. Electing those best suited to work for the interests of the country at large. And then a clear allocation of authority within this whole system. Acceptance of responsibility that goes with a role in democracy by those in government positions, and also by citizens. A well-planned election process, which has been mentioned already. To try as much as possible to get rid of the corruption in the government, understanding that every government has some part of corruption, and that all governments need to work on this particular aspect of it. To strengthen communities and local government and give people at the community level access to government. There need to be opportunities for citizens and community groups to participate in decision-making at every level of governance. Any state that's been involved in conflict, and Rwanda is definitely, with the horror of the genocide, one of the major states, requires restraint on the part of those who took sides, inclusion of all sides in governing, and willingness to forget the past and to work together. A justice system built on fairness and equal treatment under the law, and a constitution of some sort that defines those rights and obligations. And then recognition of the valid and valuable role of both genders in governance and a mutual respect for the role of each. No tolerance for rape or abuse of any kind so the country can go forward. And this is what the Prime Minister of Rwanda has been talking about, that violence is an affront to society. So just to look a little bit ahead at some of the things that, I'm just briefly, what Africa has to look for. These are sort of indicators of the future. The youth of Rwanda, there has to be a consideration of the youth and to plan a future for them because there's a very young population in Africa. The UN Habitat State of African Cities report that just came out states that by 2060, 60% of Africans will be living in the cities. Urbanization is a trend, and so there has to be planning in order to plan for housing, for education, for jobs for urban youth, sanitation, and all the regular needs of day-to-day life. And in addition to this, I add my own aspect of it. I think for Africa, one of the major things that they have to build on is technology. And I work with space technology. And I see just the beginnings of this in Africa, but I think that's a great positive for Africa to move itself forward. And then to note that in the indicators, sub-Saharan Africa is now been predicted to grow by about 6.5% next year. So there is a lot of hope there. And then just to finish up, to say that, you know, all Africans have to be within the countries themselves and together, they have to be committed to the same values. If they can find a common value system, then they can work together. And if we actually admit to it, I am. All democracies, whatever country they are in, still have a lot more work to do on this same aspect. So thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Wonderful panel with all kinds of ideas and directions. I'd like to mention an elephant in the room. I don't know why we only have one elephant in the room, but of all the countries which Professor Mazrui mentioned about uniting with Rwanda, I don't know if I heard Congo mentioned in there. So I'm not going to mention this as a place for uniting with Rwanda, but I'm going to mention it as the elephant in the room that, if not brought up today, this morning, will certainly be brought up this afternoon, and I hope that in that discussion that we can comment upon the role that Rwanda plays in the current situation in the Congo.